Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with aBlogtoWatch. I'm interviewing a colleague of mine, a nice guy, Mr. Matt Hranek. Hey Matt.
Hey Ariel, perfect pronunciation of my last name. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. I don't think you've ever actually said it out loud before, so I feel good about that.
You nailed it.
So your website is the William Brown Project, and you just wrote a book. So I guess the unofficial reason, or the official reason for this, is to plug your cool new book. But the reason I wanted to chat with you and bring this conversation to the audience is because I think that you are representative of one of the more interesting sides to this industry, which is what I call the intersection of lifestyle and story and watch. Whereas someone like myself is like purely interested in the watch, you understand how other people are also interested in the stories and people behind them, and that's actually the topic of your book, called A Man and His Watch. Maybe you could just describe in general like the elevator pitch of what your book is about.
So the book basically is an excuse to kind of be around and talk about kind of just beautiful objects and beautiful watches, just even on the aesthetic level. But what's driving these stories are the emotional connections that, in this case, men have with their timepieces. So I was meeting people like yourself at SIHH in Basel, and looking at wrists of people on the subway here in New York, and because I'm slightly personally obsessed with the object, and I felt like there was all these amazing stories to be told. There was great stories that men had relayed to me, and I pursued this project with Artisan Publishing here in New York to collect all these stories, and I did them all through interviews, and profile the watches in pictures. And that on the screen right there is my first watch, my Winnie the Pooh watch from Sears when I was about 5 years old.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, my mom still had that in the jewelry box. But I was running across great stories, a lot of dad stories, a lot of heirloom stories, a lot of stories about how these objects connect ourselves to the people that we care about, how they mark epic occasions, how they tell the world a little bit of like who you are, as a person based on that. Like that's my dad's date just that I got when he passed away with. And I just recently found all his box of papers. Like,
so he kept all this stuff?
He kept all that stuff. And I mean, he was a very organized pack rat, which was.
And a Rolex guy, apparently.
And a Rolex guy. And Rolex meant a lot to him. Rolex was his brand. Like, he bought that watch in the mid 80s, and that was everything to him. Symbol of success, symbol of great design, aesthetically right on point. Again, like I think we were car guys too. And to your point, we were always interested in the aesthetics more than the mechanics. Not that we weren't interested in the mechanics, just that the aesthetics sort of took precedent.
Why is that?
And I think I'm mechanically really stupid, first of all. Like I think I have a very short bandwidth in comprehension of mechanics and how things work, right? My brother is the absolute opposite. He's an industrial designer. He works for Tesla now, but he was the kid who broke down the lawnmower and put it all back together. And I was just sort of like, I don't know, maybe we should buy the Toro over the John Deere because of just, it's that, like that's me, that we.
But the funny thing is, you can't have I'll call it a complete product experience without taking both into consideration, right? If you just focus on functionality, you lose a lot. If you just focus on aesthetics, you also lose a lot. And I think that watches is a really good example how you kind of need to have both. Any one of those taken to an extreme is going to cause problems.
I totally agree. And I do know just enough about the mechanized element of things, at least in kind of cocktail conversation. But because I am interested in how things work, it just caps out in terms of my total knowledge of the thing.
Right. Do you ever feel like you don't know enough? Like you'd like to learn more? Or do you feel like you've had plenty of opportunities to get into a more in-depth understanding of the technicality, but for some reason it just hasn't appealed to you? I think that's actually an important point to make, because I think as watch lovers mature, they're presented with a lot of information or opportunities to learn things, and they inevitably turn some things down. So, for example, like there's this hyper focus on certain types of rare vintage watches that I could care less about. Other people go crazy about it. I'm totally comfortable not caring, but I had to make that decision, right? I had to say, here's an area of, I'll just call it information, that I have like evaluated and decided to ignore because I don't care about it. You know what I mean?
You know, I think gearheads and aesthetes and guys who collect things and like stuff are broken up into a couple camps, right?
Yeah.
And I think my camp was based on imagination of like who I wanted to be. So my love for watches was, you know, if I saw a dive watch, you know, I was a Navy SEAL. If I looked at an explorer, I was a mountain climber. Like that's how I delved into the fantasy of the thing. You know, as I get older, yes, I do think that I'm more interested in the mechanics. But to be honest with you, when I see the opening up, when I see, you know, see these movements up close, when I go and see how these watches are made, I am in complete awe. Like I am like that third world primitive seeing, you know, a horse, you know, seeing an airplane for the first time. Like my mind cannot even comprehend how complex these things are. Right. You know, I mean, here's a winemaking, you know, and the technicality and the impact of the great accidents that happen with that, you know, are completely fascinating to me. But it sort of it caps at a certain point because I just can't comprehend it, you know. And I think that's my own kind of mental limitation. But that's why I also am often just a super fan when I go on a tour of some factory. When I see how something is made, I don't care if it's a car, a wristwatch, or a widget. I become a super fan because the demystification of it becomes so normalized. And then I'm often just so impressed by the process that I just become a super fan. Like that could be a Harris Tweed mill, it could be a Porsche factory, it could be NASA, or it could be a tour of like a watch factory.
All right, let me bring up a certain kind of I'll call it the 800-pound gorilla in the room, because this is one of the things that I think injects itself into your job and my job, and I'm not always sure how to handle it. And this is the situation, okay? So you and I can go and be impressed by this nice stuff, and we can like it from an emotional perspective and a design perspective and a manufacturing perspective, but we are not what we would say are the typical buyer, right? We have access to things that other people would only have if they bought something. And I think that changes our perspective on it. And the more you know about technicality, the more you are able to make a decision or a judgment as to whether or not you feel that the product is worth the money that's being charged for it. So in the luxury industry, there's always this question of, it's amazing, I agree, I love it, but would I buy it and would I recommend that someone else buys it? So the more you learn about how something's made, the more you understand how to make a good decision as a consumer. As you learn more, do you find it increasingly challenging as an editorialist to know how to cover something, especially when you're making potential purchase recommendations? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I'm gonna make the weirdest example.
Please.
Okay. I had to help my neighbor in upstate New York, where my farm is, William Brown Farm, help him milk 18 head of cow. Okay? He's like, I need a hand. And I helped him do this, and it took hours, and it was labor intensive, and I was so impressed with the process, I forgot about it. I will never look at a glass of milk the same. The value of that product just became unprecedented. And I have the same opinion when I watch, for example, like a bespoke suit being made or a Ferrari being made. When let's take the Ferrari, like $500,000 car, $250,000 car. When you see that car made, when you see those women sewing that leather onto that steering wheel, when you see those engines being built and it dipped in the ionized paints, and when you say to yourself, okay, I totally understand why that's $250,000. It's a hand-built car. And I felt the same way when I went to Harris Tweed and I saw all, from the wool to the weaving to the dyeing to the finishing. I was like, okay, this stuff is worth $200 a yard. And I felt the same way about watches. I went to the Zenith factory. That's the most recent one I went to. And when I saw those watches made, and I always liked Zenith, but again, I was being driven by the aesthetics of
I think
stuff.
we were both there, same day.
You know, when I saw that, Ariel, I just was like, oh my God, I got to own one of these watches. I got to own one. And I think when you appreciate the process and you see the work, the time, the human element involved, that's when I really feel like, yes, this is worth my money, you know?
I think, you know, you and I share this desire to what I like to call purchase human labor, right? Like when a human being has to inject their expertise and skill into something, whatever that thing ends up being, I think you and I agree that it becomes more valuable. Whether or not we want to buy it is a matter of taste, but we agree that a skilled person putting their time into it makes something more valuable. Would you agree?
Totally.
So,
and I think, a great example of that is if you ever go to Naples and you watch these guys make a suit, you know, something that most people take for granted. They walk into like Today's Man, buy one off the rack. But when you see the craft going into that, you understand like, okay, I understand why that's a $5,000 suit.
And I think you're really good at that. You're good at identifying craft, and a lot of people like you are also good at identifying craft. But I think that we work in an industry that oftentimes hyperinflates or hyperbolizes a lot of these things that we like, such that you and I have to become people that, oddly enough, have to defend value to the audience. Maybe it's us a little bit more. I don't know what your interaction with your audience is like, but do you know what I'm saying? Like, we have to be like, no, it is worth that.
So your book, I'm going to paraphrase the title, The Most Expensive Watch, right?
The world's most expensive watches.
World's most expensive watch, right? Okay, I am taken aback sometimes with I'm taken aback when I book airline tickets in the same way. When somebody looks at you and says, oh, this is a $250,000 watch. Like, there's a part of me that's just sort of like, really? Really? Right? And it's also the same thing when you're booking a flight and you're like, hey, what's the first class round trip to Los Angeles? And they go, without even skipping a beat, they say, oh, that's $12,000. And you're like, you're joking, right? Like, you're like, it's absurd. Like, how can anything be worth that? Now, for many people, I think, who are big watch collectors, and, you know, maybe this where it gets into the fetishizing of the object and the mechanics and the labor involved. You know, I stop there. You know, I will never be that guy. I will never aspire to be. I understand the place for them, but it's just, you know, for me, just to get back to this storytelling, right? There are guys in this book that have epic watch collections and watches that are definitely more valuable than the ones that they wanted to talk about. But each person in that circumstance said, oh, if I lost this Casio F7, my life would be devastated. Like, I would be devastated. I sort of feel the same way about the date chest of my father's. It's in the, you know, vintage world. It's not a real, I mean, it's a chunk of change, but it's not a massive chunk of change. But that one, and I definitely have watched more valuable, but if I ever lost that one, it would just destroy me. If it was ever stolen, I would never sell it. You know, it's like, those are the things that I think is interesting when people start putting that intrinsic emotional value on things. That somehow is more, I can understand more than when a brand hands a watch and is like, yeah, this is $500,000. This is $250,000.
Well, the interesting thing is what you're saying is sometimes stories are where that value comes in, right? Like, if you just saw that product and you understood the technical details without the story, you wouldn't necessarily mentally accept the price. But somehow knowing that story, like makes a switch turn on your head, go from like being super almost defensive about the price to like, well, I can't afford it, but yeah, it is worth it.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why does story open our minds up to potentially feeling that something is way more valuable than 10 minutes ago we thought it was?
I think you need to make the connection. I think you somehow have to make the connection. I mean, there are people who are just going to stand there and stomp their foot and say, like, no way. But like, if you are interested in the object, if you're interested in the product, you know, like, I love dry aged steak. And when I walk into Lobel's and that stuff is like $50 a pound, like, there are people who are like, how would you dare spend $50 a pound for a ribeye steak? But I don't know. It seems worth it to me. It seems the care, the hand-holding, the the attention to detail, where it's sourced. Suddenly it becomes definable in a way. And I think watches, cars, dry-aged beef, maybe diamonds for some people, like they find that connection, and they find the value in that after.
So tell me what you think about this. I'm looking at your site and I look at your Instagram, and you can tell those areas of things that you yourself like. I have my own areas, but I think that what defines both you. What's that?
A lot of booze, Ariel.
A lot. But what defines people like you and me is I would put us in the category of what I call connoisseurs. Okay? It comes with some like elitist connotations, things like that, but the idea is that you and I are, I'll call it, susceptible to being able to distinguish between poor quality, mediocre quality, good quality, and the best quality of certain types of things, right? For you, it might be watches, cars, booze, and apparently caviar and some food. For me, it might be a few other categories. It doesn't matter what it is like we have this almost, I'll call it an affliction, because it usually causes, more problems than it does, offer solutions.
Yeah.
Where we have these particularly honed tastes where we have experienced something particularly good, even if it's like 1% better than the one that's available to everyone on a more, less exclusive basis. But once we've experienced that, we're like, oh crap, I can't go back now, or I can't pretend like I'm okay with, the less fancy pizza when I've had, world-class amazing pizza.
Right. I mean, I think that also for me is a high-low experience, right? And pizza is one of those, right? There's a pizza place here in Brooklyn called Pino's that, you and I are privileged and very lucky and blessed, where we go to these crazy dinners all the time, right? And you eat at some kind of Michelin-style dinner for some brand. Inevitably, you leave hungry, right? When I come back to Brooklyn, I go right to Pino's. And that slice and that cold Peroni is better than any Michelin meal at that point, right? So I think it's like what you like and your perception of what you like, and then how all those tastes get defined and simplified. Having good versions of all that stuff is sometimes it's just amazing. Like once you fly first class, you never want to go in those seats in the back. Ever. It's like, no way. Once you have a martini made by a great barman like Alessandro Palazzi at the Duke's Bar at like $30 a pop or whatever, like you do not want to go back to, the LaGuardia bar at Gate 25. Like you just start developing these tastes. And I think it varies in high-low experiences, like the pizza to the caviar. But I just think you start defining who you are and what you like.
But
right?
it's a dangerous journey, because each ensuing new experience we have where we learn about something that's a little bit better than the one after it, we further separate ourselves from the mainstream, and we're further alienated from experiences that make lay people happy. It's increasingly lonely because we have less and less friends that we can relate to having experiences with sometimes.
I mean, my wife thinks I'm so obnoxious. It's like, my mom thinks looking at my Instagram, my mom thinks I'm a full-blown alcoholic. And,
there's a lot of pictures of you drinking, let's be honest.
Yeah. I mean, Instagram frames a very specific world that you want to represent, right? That's just the way it is. And I don't think we should take it too seriously.
I agree with you. I'm into that.
I try to pepper it with some realism every once in a while, and but I think that, listen, developing a flavor for stuff, if it's cheap canned beer, which I love, or if it's like exotic seafood platters in the south of France, like, I don't know, it's sort of about kind of growing up, and it's about finding what you love and what you really want surrounded in your life.
So given your tastes, given the fact, I mean, I'm looking here, I have an idea of your kind of style. What kind of, I mean, there's some watches here, but describe for me and the people listening how you would sum up your own personal watch tastes.
Well, I have this theory, like you always dance with the girl you go to prom with, right?
Okay.
And my first love was Rolex. And why? Because it was my dad's first love, and we loved it together. And And again, like I loved tool watches. You know, I loved the idea of the GMT that was made for Pan Am pilots. I love the idea of the Explorer, that Hiller. You know, I love the idea of these stories that were represented by who would possibly wear these watches. And that's why, you know, like you wear an Omega Speedmaster and you're an astronaut. That's just the way it was, you know, for me. So I think my watch collection mostly has black dials, aesthetics. It's mostly Rolex, but not exclusive.
I think I've only ever seen you wearing a Rolex.
I wear mostly Rolex, or I'll wear
maybe a Speedmaster one time. I may have seen you wear a Speedmaster.
But, you know, I love G-Shock. I own G-Shocks. I have crazy one-off military pieces, you know, weird Ben Roos and Hamiltons, Seikos. You know, I travel with a Casio little F7 that's in my DOP kit, which is like the watch I use when I go for a run. You know, and I would say aesthetically, I like them all on par. You know, there's definitely, you know, there's definitely watches and brands that I aspire to that I, you know, aesthetically like, but can't afford right now. I think
that's all of us.
Yeah, like, you know, Patek is one of them.
Would you consider yourself a watch collector? I think that's important because
no.
you don't consider yourself a watch collector.
No, you know,
because you really sound a lot like someone who's a watch collector. Just saying. If
I was a watch collector in 1997, I would have just bought piles and piles and piles of Rolex Submariners.
Really? That's how you would define a watch collector? Because that sounds like someone who's speculatively buying. That's a dealer. That they're speculatively buying in order for prospective future earnings. I don't know that that's a collector.
I guess I confuse the definitions of that. I mean, I see guys who are collectors that have maybe much more obsessive collections, right? So it's quantities of stuff that reinforce the point of view. I guess I have a collection of watches. I also have like a collection of like, you know, U.S. military outerwear, right? But I guess the way I always looked at myself, and this is how I define myself to my wife so I don't get in trouble, is I'm kind of like a curator. I'm kind of like an archivist. Like I kind of am putting this stuff together as a representation of, you know, I'm saving it, right? I feel more like a museum curator than I do like a collector.
You want to know what's interesting to me? And it's you are doing a very good job at describing your collecting habits, and I find other people do it as well, but we tend to dance around it. We tend to overcomplicate it. I find sometimes we shy away from saying things like, I'm an adult, and I don't strictly need watches, but I see them as a very socially acceptable toy that I can enjoy. Why don't people just say stuff like that?
Right. Well, it's the same with cars, right? Like guys who just have piles of cars. I mean, watches are easier to store, which is great.
They sure are.
But I do think that, yeah. Well, first of all, my you know, the beautiful thing about collecting things aesthetically similar is that if you have a partner or someone in your life that really doesn't understand the nuances of the aesthetic, it never looks like you're buying another thing. So my wife will be like, "Is that a new Rolex?" And I'm like, "Oh no, this one, I've had this one," you know. And it's like it's a 1680 instead of a 5513 or whatever, you know. I think that, listen, I think for me there's a cap. Like I don't need to be obsessively collecting. Like I do kind of cap things off. But I look at my history of owning things, and I don't care if it's vintage Dunhill lighters and Zippos or, I don't know, Harris Tweeds. You know, after a while, you're sort of like, okay, that's enough. You've done it. You have it. What are you doing? You like get control of yourself. I think that's an important discipline to get, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you can't just endlessly hunt forever. Sometimes you have to decide you want to like focus on new game. I mean, you're right. There are those people that never check their collecting habits and go so deep in the whole of collecting something where they spend so much time and effort to get such little things. And like people around them are looking at themselves, they're like, this stopped giving this person a return a long time ago. They just can't seem to get out of this loop of endlessly getting the same thing over and over and over again, looking for just minutia and little details that no one else cares about. I mean, you've met guys like that, right?
Yeah. Oh my God. And you know the historic ones too. It's like drug addict behavior, right? It's like I need my fix. I need my fix. I need my fix. I need my fix. And I think you need to step back from that and just be like, oh, geez. I mean, maybe I've gone too far here. Have I OD'd?
We all sometimes do that, and hopefully we can pull ourselves out of it. Are the men in this book that you write about, are these guys people you would consider watch collectors?
Yes, some of them. Some of them? But, I think that, sure, okay, for example, Paul Newman, the Paul Newman Big Red Daytona is on the cover, and it's on the back cover. So when you open that up, when you pull the book out of this sleeve from the crown, you get an unadulterated front and back cover of a picture of Paul Newman's Rolex Daytona. The interesting thing is this is the watch that Joanne Woodward bought for him to replace the one with the exotic dial he gave away.
Do we have a picture of this? Because just so everyone knows, I haven't seen Matt's book yet.
If you scroll down, keep scrolling down.
There we go.
There, yeah, there. So, Clea Newman had that watch on her wrist, and I was introduced to her from some work I was doing, and I knew that it was her father's watch. Now, Paul Newman, according to Clea, his daughter, who I talked to extensively, he was not a watch collector. These were tool watches. He can give a crap about them. They were just objects that were very good at doing what they did. And time was really, really important to him, right? Being on time, the element of time, all this stuff. She constantly talked about how that was important to her dad. I mean, obviously, that exotic dial didn't mean shit to him, if I could say that.
It wasn't called that back then. This is how we fetishized it over the years.
Right. But he just handed it over to Nell's boyfriend, right? Because these things, but it would not even taking in consideration that his wife had inscribed this beautiful, thoughtful thing on the back. Like, these were just objects for him, right? So I think when you talk about someone like Newman, no, he's not a watch collector. But if you talk about, Graham Fowler, who's in here, Graham Fowler, who's got the most amazing, in my opinion, collection of military referenced watches. Who
is that? I pretend I don't know who that is. I don't know who that is.
Graham Fowler is a designer, men's designer of Graham Fowler Original. He's a British guy. He designs kind of classic, like British, you would describe the Graham Fowler guy would be Tricker's shoes with a lug sole, driving a Vespa, button down, or Fred Perry shirt with like a big Barber overcoat.
What was his watch?
So I photographed a Rolex Submariner 5513, a Rolex military reference 5517, and military Omega Seamasters. But he just has piles of them. And it's interesting. It comes back to this story about his dad, right? His father was in the military and somewhere in East Africa. He grew up around all these men that had like cool military issued watches, like khaki guns, jeeps, like all those things that are like, I think some men or some boys just love the idea of aesthetically. So when he started getting into watches, he concentrated on military stuff. And I would definitely call Graham a collector,
So what do these guys have in common? There's 76 watches. How many people that you featured in your book? 76 people as well? Like one watch per person? I don't know how it's organized.
I would say there's probably around, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 50 guys.
50 guys. Now, when you put a collection of items together, you start to see similarities and differences. What would you say is something that each of these people in your book had in common as being these famous watch owners? And what are things that maybe surprised you where they were all very different and you thought that they, might have had more in common?
I think, well, first and foremost, every watch that they presented as the one they wanted represented and photographed was incredibly, intensely precious object to them, regardless of intrinsic value. Okay,
interesting.
That goes without saying. I would say 9 times out of 10, they would say, if anything happened to this watch, I would be devastated, right? There was all this, these watches maintained very, very heavy emotional weight to their owners. The other thing I think was it didn't. None of this was driven through this is my most monetarily valuable thing. It was driven by this is my favorite thing for this is my favorite watch for X, Y, and Z reasons, right? Mine was the Pooh and the Pooh because it was the first one that kind of set the stage for what I loved about these little timepieces on the wrist, right? I mean, for Sylvester Stallone, who I thought for sure was going to talk about a Panerai, right? Everyone in the watch world knows how he was so influential in terms of Panerai, and Rambo's wearing a damn Panerai. But he drops in FedEx, which is extraordinary, right? This gold Rolex Submariner, Tiffany branded Submariner, and which I was so surprised that he wanted to talk about this. And he talks about like he winning an Oscar for Rocky, finally making it, wanting to mark the occasion, sees Greg Allman from the Allman Brothers asleep on an airplane, some commercial flight, who's got this kind of watch on his wrist. And he's like, I never saw anything so beautiful before. Like, I needed to mark this great part of my life with something, and this is what it is. And he gets off the plane and goes to Tiffany and buys this watch.
That sounds like a Stallone thing. I remember I had a chat with him a couple years ago, and he is a sentimentalist like that. But he's got big wrists. Like that watch probably looks like a child's watch on him.
I know, totally, right? And I think that could have been the allure of the aesthetics of a watch like Panerai. But that's why I was so surprised that this kind of delicate gold thing shows up with this very touching emotional story. And actually he says this great thing where he says, in Rocky 2, I wrote this line that says, you want to have a good time, you got to have a good watch. Which I thought, like, of course I remember that line. I was a huge Rocky.
He is, I think he is, people talk a lot about famous people who are watch collectors. For whatever reason, people don't bring up Stallone enough. Like, yes, you and I know some of the things that he was influential in and the popularity of Panerai and things like that. But I really don't think that he's given enough credit. And I also think it's interesting he just sent his watch to you in the mail via FedEx. That's a good story altogether.
Ariel, that was the most unbelievable, trustworthy, like that to me really defines, and I think you and I see this, we travel in this world, like you see this fraternity of men that are just, I think, very thoughtful and about what we are in love with and these objects. I mean, I think people are very supportive. Like if, you talk to someone and say, hey, if you ever find a type blah, blah, blah that I'm looking for, people are like, I'll find one for you. I'll find it. And they really are sincere, right? Like there's a fraternity here that doesn't really exist, particularly in my world, where it kind of transcends like the fashion world. That does not exist there.
No. It's a lot more competitive.
It's so competitive. I think the watch world, even amongst dealers, to me, seems very, very fraternal.
But it also sometimes feels like honor among thieves, let's be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, totally.
Okay,
totally.
So today we live in a very different type of watch world, right? Like you're talking about Paul Newman and some of these historical characters. And when they were buying watches, these items, yes, they had a choice on what watch they could buy, but you needed a watch, right? It was a tool that most people had. These days, watches have been, for the most part, positioned almost exclusively as luxury items. Yes, we are now in the era of the smartwatch, but that's a relatively nascent type of technology, which I don't think has hit its aesthetic stride yet, such that we can have the same type of conversation about it. But today, when people go out and get a watch for themselves, it's more of a status symbol or an item of personal pleasure as opposed to a tool. Can all these famous watch collectors that we're talking about ever exist today, or in 30 years are we going to be talking about a very different type of watch owner, collector, or just important person related to the popularity of certain timepieces? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm surprised how many younger guys are, into the watch game, right? Like,
are you really though?
No. I mean, because I see a generation that is just constantly checking their phones to see what time it is, right? So I do think it's inspiring that there's a younger generation that's into this idea of the wristwatch as a timekeeping device, as a status symbol, whatever it is for them.
I'm a lot more skeptical about it. I agree with you that they're into it, but I think they're into it for very different reasons. Very different reasons. I think it's
probably
it's a show-off
driven by
culture,
media.
and different people are trying to show off to different people. Some are trying to show off to women. Some are trying to show off to other nerds. Some are trying to show off to potential business people. I think these days people use a watch much more frequently just to say something about themselves, as opposed to I'm a discriminating consumer and I have decided that for my timekeeping needs, Omega's the best.
Right. Right. No, you're right. I think that, the need and the purpose has changed dramatically. I'm surprised how many people that, I know, let's say in the art world or in that just wear G-Shocks. They just love G-Shock.
Because that's practical as hell. If you need a durable watch to tell the time and to look cool and contemporary, can you really beat a G-Shock for the money?
No, absolutely not. And Tom Sachs is one of the perfect examples. He's in the book where he took, Tom is always modifying and rebuilding stuff and reinterpreting what we think we know in terms of pop culture and objects, blah, blah, blah. So he took a G-Shock and sewed a saddle leather band on it so it wrapped.
Can I find a picture of this somewhere? I want people to see this. Would I just type in like Tom Sachs G-Shock?
I don't think you're gonna find the picture because we didn't release that image. But this is the perfect example to get the book.
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of images to show people, but I haven't even seen this stuff yet. So this stuff is all these things you're talking about represent in the book.
Exactly.
And this is not an expensive book, by the way. I mean, you pre-order for $18.14 here on Amazon. This is not bad.
No, and I was so pleased. Listen, at the end of the day, Ariel, this was my first thing. And again, we're talking about aesthetics, right? At the end of the day, even if this was just a beautiful object that sat on somebody's coffee table or next to their bedside or in their office, that was most important to me. And this is a beautiful object. Completely, honestly, I just think it's a beautiful object. I think we were very lucky to have access to all these great stories and brands and blah, blah, blah. But I think for me, I don't know. It's a nice thing to kind of hold and look at first.
The book or the G-Shock?
The book. And then, so Tom does this, takes his G-Shock and he sews this band on it. Right, like the saddle leather band, so it looks like a Cape Cod.
Tell people who this is. For people who don't know who this is.
Okay, Tom Sachs is an American artist from New York, sculptor, painter, but he really is a builder.
Sachs, like Saks Fifth Avenue?
Sachs.
Sachs. Oh, okay.
Tom Sachs. There he is, and he has this great Mars project that is touring America, which is all made out of plywood, but they're all scale
with cameras,
lunar.
Apparently.
Yeah, that's a Hasselblad that's made completely out of plywood.
Interesting.
So he kind of is a sculptor that kind of, again, reinterprets objects and how we often look at luxury. You could look at there's a Chanel chainsaw here. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Right, and that's made out of Chanel boxes.
That's great. I've seen this guy's work before. I didn't put the face to it.
Yeah.
Neat stuff.
Tom is a very cool guy, and
I'm trying to find a picture of his watch here. It's hard to see.
Why don't you just Google Tom Sachs G-Shock? Okay.
I guess that's this thing?
There it is. Yeah. No, not that one.
No? This?
The one with that one. See how he did the...
Oh, he did like a double strap?
Yeah. So that's called the New Bedford. And the reason is why it's called the New Bedford, because it's a riff on Cape Cod. And New Bedford is the town outside Cape Cod where all the working class people live.
Ah, I get it.
So
yeah, you need to know a lot of nerdy stuff to get that one.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Tom's, and I've known him for a long time, and I knew his obsession with G-Shock.
But if you don't know Hermes, for example, you have no idea what the hell's going on.
Yeah, you got to dig a little deep. But even if you don't, it's a cool little concept that he did to kind of create this.
I personally love it when someone takes a G-Shock and makes something. I'll just call it culturally relevant and kind of ironic about this. I love that.
Yeah. And he uses a lot of G-Shocks in his sculpture too. Like if he needs a timing device, like he'll just use the heads of G-Shocks. I think in the Mars project, there's a lot of that. But, Tom is a very successful guy. He could probably pick up any watch he wanted. And, he's very proud that like that's been his watch for decades.
Yeah, but as the type of artist he is, he almost has a duty to be ironic like this. Like he can't just go out and buy like expensive watch. It wouldn't work for him.
Well, I guess not, but he definitely has expensive things in his life.
Oh, I'm sure he does. Okay, so these people that you have in the book, this is a combination of new people, old people. How did you decide personally how to include someone in your book?
Well, first of all, it was I definitely knew a bunch of people that had good stories that were already in my life, and that was going to be the easy part, right?
Yeah.
So if that was my friend David Coggins, or if that was Eric Repair, who's the chef of Le Bernardin here in New York, who I'd interviewed once before, I kind of went through that first. Then I went to the brands, and I wanted to get access to the archives of some brands that I felt had interesting stories and backstories that were connected to people. Cartier being one of them, with the Santos watch, the Tank, the Fred Astaire's watch, Alain Delon's watch that were in their inventory. They were really great about letting me into the archive. I mean, it was crazy going to that archive, Ariel. Like, we basically were like met on a corner in Geneva, like hooded, thrown in a van, and like dropped off at an undisclosed location, Like
that's like every dinner I have in Geneva. I know what you're talking about.
I thought it was after the dinners.
Oh.
But once we got on there, it was just like unprecedented access to the archive. And it was just great. Omega did the same way, like prototypes, like James Reagan, who was the head of the program, engineer, who was like basically in charge.
I've talked to him. He's a cool guy.
He's such a cool guy, right? They opened up the archives with prototypes, early moon watches, JFK's Omega. That was really exciting to me. And then after that, you started really fine tuning. I knew I wanted Stallone because I knew he was a nice conversation. It was a sensitive, thoughtful conversation. For me, Ralph Lauren was a big one in terms of the style icon, right? The Newman watch that I had seen on Clea's wrist was a very important piece to me personally, and the story behind that. And then random watches that, like the James Bond Saw watch from Live and Let Die, the magnetic in the Saw watch, that happened to be at Philips at the time. And that was really the only Bond watch that we knew was physically available, was out there. So to me as an icon, Bond had to be represented as a great watch wearer,
So one final question, because I'm sure at this point people need to just look at the book or research a lot of these stuff more. There's just too much interesting information here. But I want to play devil's advocate again a little bit here. A lot of people, and sometimes I'm a little disappointed by this, even though I understand it, make decisions about buying cool stuff simply based upon what other people who know more buy and choose, right? So it's very easy to be like, what are the popular watches represented in stories or blah, blah, blah. I'll just get one of those. And I understand that as a consumer who's busy, that's the easiest way of making a decision of cool stuff to buy, but it doesn't really add an emotional connection. What would you say to consumers? As someone yourself that comes from it, really being interested in stories, how to integrate those stories, but ultimately make your own subjective decisions about taste and what means something to you?
I think you make choices that best represent who you are, and also what you're in love with. What are you in love with? Like, what makes your heart race? Like, what makes you just fall in love when you look at it, right? Like, I'm sorry, I have romantic ideas about that. Like, when I look at that, I don't know, Rolex red sub on my wrist, I'm like, this is such a beautiful, amazing, like, I love looking at it. And I look at it 20 times a day without even taking notice of the time, right? I say, if you follow your gut of what you're passionate about and what you love. Like, sure, you could take notes from from, you have a great source on your blog, like, that gives people good information to make smart choices. Like, sure, do your research, but what do you love? What's the thing that makes your heart race? And I really feel like that's a great way to make decisions. How can you argue with love?
I think one thing that, and again, I'm just sort of guessing here, but probably all the people in your book probably used more or less that type of thought process. Yes, some of them were influenced by watches or brands that they saw on the wrists of others, but ultimately these people never asked someone, I need to buy a watch. What watch do you recommend I get? They went out there in the world, they lived their life, and they allowed their experiences to dictate to them what watch they should ultimately wear. Yes, coincidence, of course, was a factor in probably at least some stories. But at the end of the day, they didn't go out there and ask someone to tell them what watch to get. They were able to make their own decision. Would you agree to that, or am I wrong?
I mean, I think it was also a lot of these watches from a very specific time frame where there was less influences anyway, right?
Sure.
Like, I wish my dad was influenced enough to, like, buy a goddamn Rolex Daytona. Like, I would have loved to have had that, particularly an exotic dial. Like, in the 1970s, late 1970s, my dad had enough money to buy one of two watches, right? The Pulsar, the new LED Pulsar that came out in 1978, I think, roughly, and the Rolex exotic dial Daytona were roughly the same price.
Yep.
Right? My dad bought the Pulsar. That's what he wanted. That's what he was in love with. He loved new technology. He loved it.
He made looking back on that not look. The better watch was the Pulsar. Let's be honest. Today, there's the Rolex is a nicer looking one in retrospect and has more relevancy. But at the time, if you were just like putting things together and asking yourself what makes more sense, what's more relevant, like your dad was at least in it enough to know what was modern at the time.
You're right. I think the term relevant is actually correct. Like, this was like cutting edge technology. This was the most modern version of the thing, and also, Mario Andretti's in the book, right? So when I went to go shoot Mario Andretti, went to his house in Pennsylvania. He's such a cool guy. He brings us to his garage, and there's like one Indy car and a brand new Corvette. And I'm like, Mario, where's all that vintage stuff? Like, where are all those great Ferraris you drove? And he was like, listen to me. I am a race car driver. I'm not a collector of cars. Like, I want the best, the fastest, the most intense technology. I don't want vintage old stuff, right? Like, that was very cool to, like, hear him about that. And Mario had, little throwaway LED watches to Daytonas that he won from winning Daytona,
Yeah.
So I do think we are bombarded with all these influences, but I think, like, filter through it, clear the way, find the thing that best represents you, buy the best version of that you can afford. And, but Ariel, this comes with confidence, right? Like, confidence is a hard thing to teach or even acquire for some people, but
Agreed.
Be confident with the decision that, this is who you are. I think given the opportunity, most people will rise to the occasion with that,
Confidence.
But,
That's a good way to end this. Matt, thank you so much. Everyone, the book is A Man and His Watch by Matt Hranek. Thank you so much for taking the time. We should do this again.
What a pleasure, man. Thank you so much, Ariel.
Okay, talk to you later.